I was going to give a talk that was a little bit more behavioral, which is sort of an emerging research interest of mine, but to borrow a joke JP handed me, he nudged me in a different direction. So I will be talking about sort of micro and macro trends in food demand. And so, the topics are a little bit disparate. Hopefully I'll draw the connections between them for you as we go along. But as just an outline, they seem a little bit random. But hopefully I'll show you the connections between these topics as we go. So worldwide calorie trends. So this is a project that came out of my previous job working at the University of Minnesota. And these are basically every dot is a sort of a country kilocalorie relationship from 1980 to 2009, and the data here is from the FAO food balance sheets. And the idea, just the inspiration for this work, just came out of looking at these pictures and asking the question, are we going to have, the big question, are we going to, the sort of question that almost launched economics, are we going to have enough food to feed ourselves? And so we look at this kind of relationship, and you can see, a more or less linear relationship between sort of log GDP per capita and then the logarithm of kilocalories per person per day. And you can see an increase. It's not going to be a surprise to anyone in the room. There's sort of an increasing trend. As you become wealthier, you eat more calories. And then, a trend that has not gone unnoticed is, as you become wealthier, you also increase the share of the calories you consume from animal sources. And so, as you can see, roughly at the top end of the picture, roughly 30% of per person per day calories are coming from animal sources. So I guess these facts are pretty well known. I guess what I was originally asked to speak, I was asked to speak more about the developed country context. And if we just take, three big consumers, we can see that, total calorie demand has increased over time and increased markedly, particularly in the United States. There's roughly an increase from 1960 to present of, almost 900 kilocalories per person per day. So that's, if you're kind of interested in the proximate cause of the obesity epidemic, that's a big number. Even if, some of that is wasted, that's a really big increase. I think it's also informative to look at sort of what's happening towards the end of the period. Towards the end of the period, if you were to sort of cut off the diagram at 2000, you'd see that those calorie numbers have roughly stabilized, that the rate of increase has dropped to a very small number. And so the question is, have we reached sort of a level of peak consumption of calories per person per day? Or, have we reached sort of the belly limit, as we like to think about it? 4,000 calories per day is sort of a prodigious quantity of calories. I'm not that kind of doctor. I don't recommend it. The other, if you read The Economist, their New Year's issue, there was a really interesting article on sort of the share of world soy production going to Chinese hogs. And so the interesting question, so the question we were interested in looking at is, what happens to calories from animals? So the big concern is that, if everyone is going to eat, as people become wealthier, they're going to eat, an increasing share of their calories from animal sources. What does that imply for world food demand and for, more importantly, particularly, world food supply? Are we going to be able to meet it? And so we were investigating this in the context of what we so it's an ongoing project, what we like to call peak meat. So instead of peak oil, peak meat. And what we find is that, after a certain development phase, the share of calories from animal sources tends to plateau. And so after a certain point, countries become sufficiently wealthy that their share of calories from animal sources begins to decline. And so you see this trend pretty clearly across the developed world. And so that's potentially informative about what's going to happen when China sort of reaches a level of income that we are currently experiencing. I would say one of the understudied relationships is if you're interested in sort of what's going to happen to global agriculture, you need to be very interested in what's going to happen to how many mouths do we have to feed. And so if you look at the, I guess it's on your right, my right as well. If you look at the right axis here and that black line, those are the UN population projections. They look very much like the Census Bureau in the US puts out a series of projections as well, and they look very similar. And they have a high, a low, and a midline projection. And so if you're interested in how much food we're going to need to feed the population, you're interested in sort of two things. You're interested in how many mouths and sort of what is the average mouth eating. And you can see that the midline projections have us at about 9 billion people in 2050. What's perhaps less well appreciated is the composition of the population in 2050 is going to be markedly different from what the population looks like today. In particular, now currently, roughly 10% of the population is of the global population is over 60. That's going to double by 2050. So we're going to be in a world with a much higher elderly population, and that has not been factored into most forecasts of global demand. The share of the population under 20 is going to drop dramatically. So again, in principle, that should affect what we think people will eat going forward. Just to sort of emphasize the point, I'm going to show you a couple of these. India in 2010 has kind of what we think of as a fairly traditional age pyramid. Sort of lots of younger people and relatively few elderly. By 2050, you can see India sort of is going to have an age pyramid that looks a lot like actually sort of contemporaneous age pyramids in the developed world. And if you look at China, China's going to have China's population is aging rapidly. You've noticed that they're starting to relax the one-child policy as a result. Their surplus labor has dropped to roughly zero. And their working age population is forecasted to decline. So sort of this surplus labor out of China is declining quickly. And you can see that in 2050, China is going to be have a relatively elderly population. In particular, it's going to have an age pyramid that looks more like Japan, which we'll see in a second. If you look at Canada, interestingly, both Canada and the U.S. Have age pyramids that look similar and actually fairly different from most other developed countries. And it's not a surprise to anyone in this room. It's principally driven by in-migration to compensate for lower native birth rates. And so that gives Canada, I would say, if you want to talk about the health of these sorts of age pyramids, which people are interested in, gives Canada Canada and the United States, relatively healthy age structures going forward. And so in particular, if you're worried about, your Social Security payments, both in Canada and the U.S., there looks to be sort of younger people who will pay into the system as people pay out. And so the demographics will change and the population will age, but the population the change in the population age structure is not going to be as dramatic as places like Germany, where all of a sudden you move to something that looks far more like an inverted pyramid than a sort of traditional population pyramid. Japan is even more dramatic. So Japan has sort of the age structure that we think of as a very elderly population, and it's only it's only going to get more severe. Just, as a humorous aside, a Japanese colleague of mine explained to me sort of their interest in domestic robots. A lot of it comes from not being quite sure how to deal with a population structure that has, most of the people over 65. So, they need basically surplus labor, which they simply don't have. And they have basically zero in-migration. So the idea here is that, the population of Japan is going to be extremely elderly, and that, again, is going to affect their food consumption. So any sort of exercise in trying to understand what global food demand is going to look like in 2050 is going to require some sort of guesstimate of what GDP is going to look like. So I don't have the Indian or Chinese GDPs on here. These are consensus forecasts from a variety of sources. So we've essentially averaged over both the U.S. Forward projections. We've averaged over the World Bank forward projections, and a couple of private sector sources are also sort of, we benchmarked them over a couple of proprietary private sector sources of GDP per capita going forward. And so, you can kind of see where the projection takes over, but some of this is linked definitely to the age distribution, that, Canada and the U.S. are going to have populations that are far younger and potentially more entrepreneurial than, say, Japan and Germany. So what does our projection of sort of global requirements look like? Well, so the good news is, we go from about 7,000 trillion kilocalories per person per day to about 11,000. I fancy myself something of an econometrician, and so the disappointing result in all of this is that if you just ran a straight line through the current trend, you actually do pretty well, and maybe that whole PhD thing wasn't worth it. Grad students ignore what I just said. The other sort of really, we went to considerable efforts in this forecasting exercise, and we come very close to the FAO projections as well. So we're a little above them, but not so much that it makes much of a difference. I would say the other takeaway message from this is that the average composition of a calorie across the world is important, but it's not nearly as important as the average number, as the number of mouths to feed. So the difference between 3,200 calories per person per day and 3,400 calories per person per day, it seems like an important number until you multiply it by billions of people. And really, what drives these projections more than anything else is simply the number of mouths to feed, which is sort of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that every time the UN has revised their population projections, up till the most recent revision, they've always revised them down. They've always sort of failed to account for falling fertility rates. The most recent projection, it's a good news story because it has to do with the success of anti-HIV drugs in Africa, is that they've actually revised population projections up in their most recent estimate. So for the first, this is literally the first time ever that the UN has raised, when they update their projections, they've updated them up rather than sort of sequentially lowering the population in 2050. And that's largely due to increased longevity in the face of HIV/AIDS in Africa. And that's where most of the extra population is winding up. So how did we, we've got a model of sort of food calories. What we'd like to know now is, can we know what people are going to, in equilibrium, demand. What we'd like to know is, is there sufficient capacity to supply them? And so the model is, we wanted to write down the simplest possible model that could plausibly explain sort of global food demand. And so this is a very parsimonious, very reduced form model. And I'm just putting up a picture here of kind of the main inputs and outputs of it. What's nice about the model is it's entirely modular, so that if you don't like for example, our projections, if you think, I'm a terrible econometrician and, global calories are going to be way higher than I put up, you can simply replace, you can simply slot in your own model of global food demand, and the model will solve out for whatever projections you care to put in. And so we have basically three sources of demand for calories. I'll talk briefly about the ethanol numbers in a minute. We have basically consumption by people, and then we have consumption for cotton, which there are three separate modules. I'm not really going to talk much about cotton. We then essentially, we project forward demand for calories from animals and calories from plant-based sources. We then, when we do that at a global level, we then essentially solve out for supply spatially, and then look at where those calories will be grown as a function of where they're grown now. So we don't completely redistribute the world's calories based on sort of complete assumptions about free trade. We assume that there's some stickiness in where things are grown, that there's a revealed preference argument that if people are growing soy in one spot, they're not going to suddenly switch to a different commodity based on soil suitability indices. So these are our biofuels numbers are one part art, one part science. The bottom line with biofuels is that there are a lot of mandates for biofuels that tend to be relaxed in the breach. So lots of places have standards that they've sort of imposed going forward for biofuel requirements and mixing into domestic fuel. In practice, many of those are relaxed when food prices hit. If food prices are too high, governments tend to let those slide. And so we compiled essentially all of the requirements that we could find and tried to see how often they were actually enforced. And it was very infrequently that these things were actually enforced. We used a variety of models to project these forward. I would say the takeaway message is that biofuels, while seem like a big deal, in terms of the global calorie numbers, they're really a rounding error. They're not that important in terms of forecasting global calorie demand. So if we look forward at where these, what are sort of the growth areas for these calories? We see sort of cereals increasing at a roughly proportionate rate. The big increases are in fruits and vegetables and in sugarcane, which actually is the ethanol story. So if you're interested in where those calories are going to be coming from, as countries become wealthier, they're going to shift out of basic grains, shift into meats, and shift in up to a certain point, and then increased share of calories from fruit and vegetables as they become wealthier. So we have a land allocation model. This is simply to convince you that it's enjoyably confusing. The idea of the land allocation model is simply essentially what we do is we solve it iteratively. So we project forward a global demand for calories of various kinds. We then allow the current regions to produce what they produced. If that's enough, great, the model stops. If it's not, the model adds acreage where that good is produced. So we don't add, strawberries to Saskatchewan in December. We add strawberries to California. And so, everything gets added to where the land availability is. As more land is required, it comes into production out of, based on this GAEZ spatial soil suitability table. And we basically pull land into production based on what's produced nearby. So we're not reallocating things around the world. That's sort of a key component. So how much land do we need? Is, I think, again, sort of a good news story. we don't need to vastly increase the acreage to feed the world. In fact, we need to increase it, but we don't need to sort of completely plow under the Amazon. We get to, in our high projections, it's a significant increase in the sort of areas farmed, but it's not overwhelming. We don't go to 100%, and we don't have to start chopping down massive quantities of forest. I mean, we may do that anyway, but we don't have to. Where is this going to be grown? Most of the increase is going to happen in low and middle income countries. And the largest increases are going to come in Africa and the Latin America and the Caribbean. Those are the areas with large areas to grow. And frankly, in the case of Africa, where the largest demand is going to be. So if you look at the population projections for Africa, if you want to keep yourself up at nights, they're a little bit frightening. But the upshot is that under low, medium, and high scenarios, most of the increase in acreage is coming from the developed and developing world, and most of that is coming from Africa and Latin America. Where does most of I said in some sense. Why don't we have to plow under the world if we have to increase calorie consumption by real margins? And a lot of our results here are driven by projections in yields. And so we have a very, I would say, somewhat fancy model of projecting forward yield. So we have a rich set of models that project forward crop yield. So this is just one example. And what we do is we project forward by sort of region by crop specific yields, and then we forecast those out to 2050 for about, there are sort of 9 different models. There's one more model than is indicated here. And then we average over models in each period, so we get essentially an average forecast for a variety of different models. And we do this for every region, for every crop. And then that gives us our rough approximate growth path for yields. So one of the important things to remember about yield growth is it's running really hard to stay in place. So yield growth doesn't happen on its own. The yield growth necessary and the yield growth we forecast is well below, for example, another green revolution. We're forecasting yield growth, but nothing that is out of keeping with sort of historical yield growth. We're not expecting another doubling of productivity. So this is the punchline for most of the paper. It's a great picture. I won't tell you how long it took to make, but again, if these slides are made available, you can have a look at it. It's sort of hard to read, but you can see where the acreage is coming in across crop types. So I want to change topics a little bit and focus more on domestic, and by domestic I mean U.S. Apologies, as a Canadian, that always annoys me just a little bit. But so we're going to talk about food prices and food spending. And just the point I want to emphasize here is that food prices in the U.S. have been stable essentially since the 1980s, with the exception, and further back, if you look at sort of so these are relative food prices. These are prices relative to CPI. So food prices have been relatively stable over a long period, and I think they will continue to be stable over a long period. So we look at both food at home and food away from home prices. You can kind of see, food at home prices increased less quickly than inflation over sort of the 80s to 90s and into the early aughts. And then there was sort of the well-known food price spike in the mid-noughts. And then you can see the effect of the recession in sort of declining food prices. And then they have recently trended back up. And so I think food prices, though, I think they are likely to stay very close to inflation, for the foreseeable future. I don't think there's any real cause to be super alarmed about food prices going forward. Trends in expenditure. So I didn't have quite an effort. I didn't have time to update these to the most recent numbers, but the idea here is to look at sort of what was the effect of the Great Recession on both total spending and on food spending. And we can see, expenditure, as you'd expect in a recession, declined a little bit. Notice, apologies, these are quartiles of the income distribution. So first quartile is the lowest income households, and fourth quartile are the wealthiest households. And what you can see is that, total expenditure declined, and food expenditure declined across three quartiles. But I'd like you to just, and this is called foreshadowing, pay attention to the bottom quartile, where you can see actually that the total expenditure, if anything, was flat, or if you squint at it enough, might look like it's increasing a bit. And in particular, food expenditure also increased. So I'm going to talk a bit about, at the end, why that's the case. If we put this in share form, as we like to do, you can see that during the recession, food away from home shares declined, and food at home shares increased. So, that emphasizes the value of intermediate micro. One's a necessity, one's a luxury. And so in a recession, people substituted food away from home into food at home. So we can see that, this is by expenditure. On average, the most recent numbers I've seen is that expenditures are roughly 50-50, on average 50-50 between food away from home and food at home in the U.S. now. It's quite different from the Canadian numbers. That's expenditure. People sometimes confuse that with like calories or meal occasions. The meal occasion numbers and calorie numbers are still very different. People consume, many more of their calories from food at home than from any other source. Where are people eating their food away from home? That's been sort of an interest. Food at home, particularly in the recession, again, what you might expect, people switched away from full-service restaurants and switched into fast food restaurants. And you can see this in the rise of sort of fast casual dining options like Chipotle and Panera Breads. So those experienced real growth during the recession, and McDonald's did particularly well with its sort of dollar value menu. So I want to talk about time use as well. So as economists, we spend a lot of time thinking about the budget constraint, and what we ignore is that there are really two budget constraints. And actually, if you think about the budget constraint that binds, it's the sort of 24 hours in a day budget constraint. It's not the, you can always go get a second job. You can always, argue for a raise. That budget constraint is somewhat malleable. You can't add hours to the day. And so kind of an understudied relationship is the relationship between time use and food behaviors. That's hard to do, so I'm just going to show you a few pictures. I have some other work on it. The upshot, this data is from what's known as the American Time Use Survey, which has been it's in its 11th, it's currently fielding its 11th round. It's a time use survey that's a one-day, essentially, time diary. That's great along some dimensions. It's a real consistent series about how people use their time. It's problematic along other dimensions. If you think about, how long people fill in expenditure surveys, right? They do it for a week, they do it for 2 weeks, and we try to infer, a lot about their food consumption based on a week's worth of data or 2 weeks' worth of data. The ATUS, because it's a really onerous survey to fill in, they do that based on a single day. So the data tends to be highly variable. And it's very hard to see, my experience with the ATUS is it's often very hard to see deep patterns in the data simply because it's extraordinarily noisy, because we're recording behavior on a single day, and we don't get to see, time spent over weeks. But with that caveat, what can we see based on the most recent ATUS data? So this is time spent in food preparation, again, across income quartiles. And as you'd hope, I mean, you get a broadly sensible answer that low-income households who have a lower opportunity cost of time are spending more time in food preparation than wealthier households who face a higher opportunity cost of time. You can absolutely see the effect of the recession, where people increased their use in home food production. Increased the use of time in home food production. And again, you see the largest increase for low-income households. I think, again, if you want to sort of really squint at too few data points, you can look at the end of the series, and you can see that as the economy has recovered, particularly in the United States, people, particularly the poorest households, are spending less time in food preparation. So that is reverting. It hasn't reverted to its pre-recession levels, but it seems to be converging back to pre-recession baselines. Interestingly, if you look at the other quartiles of expenditure, they seem to be still going up, albeit not at quite the same rate they increased during the recession. Food shopping, I mean, so please, I'm not sure what's going on in the third quartile there. They seem to be misbehaving. But if you look, you could think of food shopping as being engaged. So, if I want to think about food shopping, what I think of time spent food shopping is households engaged in search activity. So how much time do you spend food shopping is not a bad indication of, how much time are you spending, looking for lower prices. I mean, so we also, it's also correlated with if you shop more, it takes more time. There's a fairly linear relationship there. And we also see the same sort of pattern, that during the recession, people increased time use in shopping, so they increased their time in search activities, and that increase was highest for the lowest income households. And again, as the economy has recovered, those trends have declined. And then I just think this is interesting. Basically, all of these other ones show real clear patterns in. That have to do with sort of the macroeconomic conditions, but people seem to have spent roughly the same amount of time eating across the macro cycle. So now we've talked a little bit about sort of various topics. I want to talk a bit about nutrition and trends in nutrition. So the first thing I need to put some words. I tried to do this with as few words as possible, but I need to define what I mean by nutrition, and so how I'm going to define that is using a fairly standard USDA-developed metric of nutrition. It's known as the Healthy Eating Index, so HEI. The particular revision of the HEI we're using is HEI 2005. HEI 2005 basically it's a diet scoring rule is the right way to think about it. The one detail that's sort of important is it's a per-calorie diet scoring rule. So the idea is it measures the nutritional quality of an individual calorie. It doesn't measure, if you ate an exceptionally healthy 10,000 calorie diet, again, I'm not that kind of doctor, but I will tell you that's bad for you. So quantity matters, but the HEI would give you a very good score. So the HEI abstracts from overconsumption. It really looks at the nutritional quality of an average calorie. So, what has sort of let me just the components of the score listed in black generally are what are known as nutritionists hate when I say this, but those are good foods. Nutritionists get really grumpy that there's no such thing as a good food. So I will call those adequacy foods, which is the preferred terminology. But if in your heads you want to call them good foods, I won't get mad at you. And then in red, those are called bad foods, or if you're a nutritionist, moderation foods. So we're going to talk about adequacy and moderation on the slides, but if you want to translate that to good and bad, no one will get too upset, at least in this room, I hope. So the idea here is that there are components of the HEI that raise that you want to have more of, and components of the HEI that you want to have less of. We want to look at We want to look at the trends in these, and the trends in sort of how people have been eating, and we're going to do this over the sort of the longest stretch we could manage. I think there's kind of a general consensus that if you just sort of, ask your average person in the street, which is rarely a good thing to do, but if you ask that person, are people eating better than they were a generation ago? I think your consensus answer would be no. People are eating worse. We have diets based on the notion that if I could only eat like a caveman, I would eat much more healthily. My brother's on this paleo diet that, he really wants to turn back the clock on his diet to sort of, millions of years ago. So I think if you ask people, are we eating better than we were a generation ago, most people would say no, but they would be wrong. What we see is that if we look at, so this is the distribution of diet quality across the population over time. And so what we've done is we've traced out the distribution for each cohort of, so these are waves of the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, which is an intake diary. So it actually measures consumption, not expenditure. And what we see is that over the last, since the 89 survey period through to the most recent survey period, for all levels of nutrition, so if you look at the lower panel, people are in general eating a little bit better. Not a lot better, I'm not saying that, but statistically significantly better. And if you try to translate these changes in HEI, so this HEI score has been, linked, has been validated medically and linked to a number of health outcomes. And it does, these gains have been large enough to have significant biological implications as well. And so we do see an increase in diet quality over time, albeit a small one. And I think the most important point of this is, we don't worry too much about Bill Gates's diet in general. So we do worry about lower income households' diets. And what we see is that even for people who had poor diet quality, they have experienced gains in diet quality over a generation. So even people with low diet quality are eating better than they were, or the lowest diet quality has increased over time is probably the technically correct way to say that. Can we decompose why diet quality has improved? So we use a variety of, I will call them semi-fancy techniques to try to understand why diet quality has improved. And we see a couple of driving factors. The first is reformulation. So this suggests there's a fairly large role for the food industry in helping improve diet quality. So we see, depending on where you are in sort of the income distribution, particularly for low-income households, a large share of the improvement in diet quality is due to foods being, more healthily formulated as a result over time. So you could think about, the story we're trying to tell here is you could think about phasing out trans fats has made people essentially healthier with little effort on their part. And we see that gain is particularly large in for low-income households. We also see a large chunks of the CH. I had to put a few Greek letters just to prove that it was worth getting a PhD. So the Psi-H is the essentially change in diet quality that we can attribute to demographic factors, such as we talked about earlier, an aging population, and but it captures both the effect of aging population and the changes in demographics in the United States over the last 30 years. So a more Hispanic, more Asian population, and a younger population. And then, for the grad students in the room, you'll notice there's a big residual term. So this is clearly a project that could benefit from more effort. So there's a lot of the improvement that remains unexplained. There's a large improvement, but we can't explain all of it. So one way of trying to think about these things is to try to decompose them. So let's dig a little deeper into the age portion of this. So one way of trying to decompose changes in trends, and it's an interesting technique, and it's been widely adopted in sort of the sociology literature, are these what are known as age period cohort models. And what an age period cohort model tries to do is say how much of a given trend is attributable to how old you are, what period are you in, so the effects of contemporaneous effects. The age effects are essentially biological effects. What's the effect of being a certain age? And then cohort effects. What are the effects of being born in a certain year and experiencing a certain shared history? And so just to give you a sense of these scores, these... 5 minutes. Oh, okay. So basically what we see is that the age component explains a huge share of diet. In particular, if between the ages of 15 to 50, you're less likely to eat, or it significantly reduces your average HEI score. So again, age matters a lot. Moderation, basically, so here we've flipped it, so less moderation foods is good, and so as you age, you tend to consume fewer bad foods. I'm not going to talk about the cohort scores, but they'll be in a paper at some point. I want to take my last 5 minutes and talk about the federal food assistance. Why do I want to do that? It's something as a Canadian who lives in the U.S. that I think most Canadians are completely ignorant of, and I will be prepared to be shocked. But what share, so many of you are aware of the Farm Bill, right? What share of the Farm Bill has anything to do with the farm? It's like 30%. Okay, so it's a tiny share of the Farm Bill. And so if you're interested in knowing why what we can do, why the government thinks it has a role, particularly in the United States, about intervening in sort of the diet quality of its citizens, it's largely due to the Farm Bill. And in particular, the nutrition programs in the Farm Bill are, roughly 70% of the total Farm Bill. So if you worry a lot about sort of trade distortions and because of sort of, U.S. crop insurance programs, crop insurance is a rounding error on the SNAP program. So SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. You may know it better as food stamps. It is a huge deal. I can't kind of emphasize, if you haven't experienced it, it's hard to emphasize how large a program this actually is. But I just to try to give you some sense, if you look at, so you can clearly see the effect of the recession here, and kind of what I want you to look at is that, both lines at the top in the most recent years, roughly 15% of the U.S. population participates in SNAP. Okay? That's 15, there's roughly 15 million participants. It got as high as 17% at the peak of the recession. That's just a huge and overwhelming, if you go into every supermarket in the U.S., you will see a little sign that says, EBT accepted here. And what EBT stands for is Electronics Benefits Transfer. And it looks a lot like a credit card. But remember, this is a food stamp, so it's an in-kind transfer. So you are given an allotment every month to spend on food. Low-income households are given an allotment every month to spend on food. And it comes with some requirements. So this is why when you hear people getting really kind of, particularly Coca-Cola and Walmart, getting up in arms when, say, Mayor Bloomberg proposes to take soda or sugar-sweetened beverages off of SNAP, or not make them eligible for SNAP. That's why you get really large pushback. It accounts for roughly 50% of food spending by low-income consumers in the U.S. It accounts for roughly 1 in 10 food-at-home dollars spent in the U.S. So this is a massive program. It comes with educational components. It comes with signage. It is this extremely large program that really does influence the diets of millions. And it is at the center of, at the moment, of a very controversial debate about how much of it. So the original intent of the SNAP, or the food stamp program at the time, was to sort of reduce malnutrition. It's clearly been achieved, and so the question is now how much should SNAP be used to, as a nudge to pull this full circle, to improve diet quality. And that is at the moment a very controversial topic between people in sort of the nutrition community and people in the sort of poverty community. And the sort of the group in the poverty community says that restricting these benefits will make them less attractive to people, and thereby sort of undermine the initial intent of the program, which was to reduce food insecurity. And the nutrition community says, well, we can relatively costlessly try to increase the quality of people's diets as a function of this. So just to give you a sense, what is the average benefit? It's about $140 per month per person for people on SNAP at the moment. The maximum benefit for a family of 4, I think the most recent numbers are around $500 a month. So this is real money. And this for the very poorest of households will account, for 20% of SNAP participants, this is all of their food spending. Okay, so this is all of the money they spend on food in a month. So I think I will draw a line there. I just acknowledge this. I mean, this draws from a bunch of different work, obviously. And I'll just acknowledge Travis Smith, who's at the University of Georgia, one of my former grad students, and Charlotte Tuttle, another one of my former grad students, who's at the Economic Research Service of USDA. And then the initial stuff draws on work from colleagues at the University of Minnesota, particularly Phil Pardee, Jason Beto, and Terry Hurley. And I'd gladly take any questions on any of it.